So in this video, I'd like to talk about self-compassion and self-love and how we can cultivate self-love to a greater degree. In the last video on healing, I touched a little bit on this subject, and I think it's actually really important to get into on a deeper level. Over the years of experience in my practice, what I've come to realize is oftentimes when you dig into somebody's case a little bit, what you come to realize is that when things aren't really shifting or they're not changing as quickly as you'd like, it comes down to that person having a lack of self-love. And then it's showing up as resistance, and it's showing up as, various reasons and various ways that they're not able to actually move past whatever it is that they're trying to heal, whether it's something that shows up on the physical level, the mental, emotional level, or even the spiritual level. So a concrete example that I can share with you is, sometimes you'll have a patient who comes in and they seem highly motivated to get better. And you give them several suggestions. And then at the follow-up visit, you ask them, so how are things going? What's been happening? And they say, for the first week, I was totally fine. I was really on track. And then work got really busy, and then suddenly everything just went back to how it was. I stopped exercising, I stopped doing the dietary advice, I stopped meditating and doing kind of the mental emotional work. And digging into that a little bit, you ask them, okay, so what prevented you from just restarting all those things? Oh, I just felt so bad about myself. I felt so guilty. And therein lies the issue, right? Because really, ultimately, what is that? They're not forgiving themselves for falling off track. And when do we not forgive ourselves? When do you not forgive somebody? I think it comes from a lack of self-love for the most part. So I think it's a really, really big piece of the puzzle, and one that I think needs to be talked about a little bit more frequently. So where can we start? Where can we start with self-love and self-compassion? Well, I think the first thing is having a desire to cultivate it. That's always the first step. But I think most of us are there. Most of us want to feel better. Most of us want to have a better relationship with ourselves. And then the second step is observing it, right? Just observing the ways that a lack of self-compassion manifests for you. This could be thoughts that you have towards yourself that are just really hurtful, painful thoughts. I forget what I was watching, but essentially it was a video that said, if we talk to our kids the way that we talk to ourselves. And obviously the point of it was to say we would literally never do that, but we do it to ourselves every single day. So just become aware of how frequently you're engaging in thoughts that put you down, thoughts that are overly critical, thoughts that are just mean-spirited. And don't engage them. Don't argue with yourself. Don't worry about that stuff. Just observe it and say, that's interesting. Here I am, I'm doing my best, and yet I'm criticizing myself for being lazy, or for being unintelligent, or whatever it is, right? We all have these thoughts in our heads that are not so kind. But just become aware of it. And I think the next step after that, after you kind of catch yourself, because the awareness piece is huge, and I think we often miss it because it's so habitual for so many people, right? We habitually speak to ourselves in a certain way. And it's partly about changing that habit. So once you become aware, kind of change the thought. Ask yourself, is there another way for me to perceive this? Is there another way for me to look at myself in this way? And are there different words that I can use? So for instance, if you're not motivated, let's say you're trying to get something started, you're trying to work on a project, but for some reason you just can't seem to bring yourself to do it. Some people in that situation might criticize themselves and say, God, I'm so lazy. Like, if I weren't so lazy, I'd be able to just get this done. But what I want to suggest to you is, just be a little bit softer, just a little more gentle. Yes, it is a fact, right, that you're not getting something done, and maybe that is a problem, genuinely. But do you need to be so hard on yourself when you recognize that? Or could you gently ask yourself, what is preventing me from doing this? Is it that I'm lazy? Like, do I have a history of being lazy? Is that really a thing for me? Or is it that or is it something else? Could you say to yourself, yeah, maybe I didn't start that project on time, but I'm working towards getting there. Just softening it a little bit. And then I think once you get into the habit of that, it'll be interesting to reflect back, because you'll see just how mean to yourself you were in the past. And you'll notice a shift in how you are as well, right? When we ourselves attack ourselves, it feels so terrible. And the world is full of criticism. We don't need it coming from inside too. So when you start to shift and you start to speak to yourself in a more conscious and more compassionate way, you will actually feel better. You'll feel different. And also just notice what happens when you start to speak to yourself differently. For me personally, I know that I had huge resistance, and to a certain extent still do. If you reframe something to a more compassionate way of saying it, there's going to be a part of you that's going to say, I'm delusional. This is crazy. I'm actually just a lazy person. And that's okay. Let that thought be there. It's totally fine. It's, once the mind has developed a way of thinking about things and a way of being, anytime there's pushback, anytime there's change, it's sort of like society, right? Anytime there's a new idea or a new concept, most of the time it's attacked really, really intensely. And then, as time goes on, it's accepted. And it'll be the exact same thing within your own psyche and within your own heart. But I think the important thing is to just keep doing it. Even if it feels awkward, let that harsh voice be there, but don't engage it. And then the other thing that I often ask myself, so you probably have a sense of how you feel when you know that you're not acting from a place of self-compassion. Maybe you overextend yourself because you don't want your boss to be upset with you, for example, or because you want your marriage to go smoothly, or whatever it is, right? Notice how you feel when that happens. Maybe there's a little bit of resentment that builds up. Maybe there's a bit of anger. Maybe there's just a general negative feeling. Just become aware of that. And the reason I say that is because that will be your tell. Like, that will sort of point you in the direction of how often are you feeling that way. Because I think sometimes people don't realize how little of the time they actually act from a place of self-compassion. And all they know is that they don't feel good. So just pick up on those clues as well. And notice how it feels when you do start to act from a place of self-compassion. From personal experience, I can tell you it'll probably feel very, very uncomfortable. When you start doing things more for yourself, when you start to put yourself first, it does feel very, very uncomfortable. But I think that's a good sign. It means you're growing, and it means that things are changing. And you can't really go wrong by putting yourself first. I think sometimes there's this idea that if we put ourselves first, we're being selfish, or we don't care enough about other people. But I just want to ask you to consider that and think about that on a deeper level. The example that I sometimes give my patients is, when you're on a flight, they go through the safety procedures and they tell you that if the pressure drops in the cabin, then the oxygen masks will come down. And what do they say in that video? Or in that, I forget if it's a demonstration or a video, but what do they say? They say, if you're traveling with a child, put your mask on first before you help your child. I remember the first time I saw that, and I thought, oh, that's weird. I would instinctively put the mask on my kid first. But I think upon reflection, it makes perfect sense, and it's true for life as well. If you aren't able to breathe, and something happens, nobody's going to help your kid, right? Or you, at least you can't help your kid. I'm sure somebody would, hopefully. But it's true for life too. You know, we have to, our cup has to be full in order for us to help other people. If you're depleted, if you're not well nourished, if you don't feel taken care of, you're not going to be able to help other people. And your job is going to suffer, your marriage is going to suffer, everything that you're working towards will suffer because you're depleted. So, and all of this, I think, roots back to self-love. You know, give yourself what you need and feel good about it, because it's so important. And then, right. So sometimes I ask myself, how would I behave if I were coming from a place of self-love? And this, I would say, don't start necessarily with this exercise. Start first with becoming aware of how often it is that you're not coming from a place of self-love. But once you've gotten there, it's a good idea to ask. So once you start to, it's easy, for example, once you start to feel that feeling of kind of dread or resentment already building up before you've even committed to something, this happens, a good example of this is through email. So like sometimes you'll get an email and somebody will ask you to do something, and inside you know that you don't want to do it for whatever reason. You don't have to justify it, you just don't want to do it. But you'll feel like you have to. And it's almost like before you even have a minute to consider it, you're already typing out a response saying, yeah, sure, I'll be there, that sounds great. But if you feel that feeling, then what I encourage you to do, if you're able to, is just pause for a second and ask yourself, number one, why am I feeling this way? And number two, how can I act so that I honor myself and that I don't do things that I don't necessarily want to do? And I think that's really important too, because it's putting yourself first. It's saying to yourself, no, I'm going to listen to this voice inside of me that says, I actually don't want to do this. So always listen to that. And then the third way that we can kind of get in touch with this, because some people will say, well, I don't actually know what it would look like to act with self-love. And in those cases, what I say is pretend it's your kid, or a child if you don't have a child. Pretend it's a kid. How would you react if a kid told you that they didn't want to do something? Would you push them and force them to do it? Or would you say, okay, why don't you want to do it? You'd explore it, right? And maybe you'd say, that's okay, sweetie. Like, if you don't want to do it, we don't have to. Or, how would you treat a child who, let's say they started doing the dietary recommendations, they started exercising, and then work got busy, and suddenly they're not doing it? Would you beat that kid up and say, you're so lazy, like you never accomplish anything, you're terrible? I mean, I hope most of us wouldn't ever do that, right? We'd say, that's okay, like you fell off track, and it happens. Get back on. That's life, right? It's constantly ebbing and flowing. Nobody's always doing well. Nobody's always happy. Nobody's always succeeding. It goes up and down, and that's the journey of life. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up so much. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say about self-compassion. Try some of these exercises, see how they feel, and give yourself more self-love. It's really